The small town of Ravenswood had long been rumored to harbor a dark secret. Nestled on the outskirts of the town was an ancient forest, known only as the Whispering Woods. Its twisted trees loomed like skeletal fingers, and a thick mist perpetually clung to the ground, hiding the footsteps of those who dared to enter. It was said that anyone who ventured too far into the woods never returned the same. Some didn't return at all. The locals spoke of strange noises that drifted from within, soft whispers in the wind, hushed voices that seemed to call out in the dead of night, and the occasional eerie figure glimpsed between the trees. Yet, every time someone ventured into the forest in search of answers, they were either lost or returned with wide, terrified eyes and broken minds. One cold autumn evening, a young man named Jake arrived in Ravenswood. He had heard the tales of the Whispering Woods growing up, and now, as an adult, he was determined to see for himself whether the rumors were true. Jake wasn't a believer in ghosts or curses. He had always been the logical type, the kind of person who believed that every unexplained sound or flickering shadow had a reasonable explanation. He had come to the town on business, but the stories of the forest intrigued him. They gnawed at the back of his mind, like a puzzle that begged to be solved. That night, he walked to the tavern at the edge of town, a place where the locals gathered to share their stories and drink away the fears of the day. The moment he entered, the chatter died down, and all eyes turned toward him. The tavern keeper, a grizzled man named Old Tom, looked at Jake over the rim of his glass. "You're the new guy in town," Tom muttered, wiping a rag across the bar. "You've heard the stories, right?" Jake gave him a nod, his curiosity getting the better of him. "I've heard enough. I'm going in tomorrow." The room fell dead silent. A few of the older men at the tables exchanged nervous glances, their eyes wide as if they were witnessing the beginning of something inevitable. "You don't know what you're messing with," Tom warned. "The woods, they change people. It's not just the trees. Something's in there. Something old. Something evil. If you go in, you may never come out the same." Jake chuckled. "I'll be fine. I've dealt with worse." A quiet murmur of disbelief passed through the room. "Don't say I didn't warn you," Tom said, his voice low and urgent. "If you hear something, if you hear voices, don't follow them." Jake gave a dismissive wave and left the tavern. He wasn't afraid. The whispers, the warnings, they were nothing more than superstition to him. The next morning, Jake set out for the forest. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the twisted trunks of ancient trees. A sharp breeze rustled the leaves, and the faint sound of whispers carried through the air, but Jake told himself it was the wind. He wasn't afraid. The deeper he walked into the woods, the quieter it became. The sounds of the outside world, birds, insects, even the occasional rustle of a squirrel, seemed to fade, swallowed up by the trees. The air grew heavier, colder, and the fog thickened, curling around his feet like something alive. Jake pressed on, ignoring the uneasy feeling settling in his chest. His eyes flicked to the dark shadows between the trees, but nothing moved. No animals. No people. Then he heard it. At first, it was faint, a whisper. Just a flicker of sound, like a soft murmur drifting through the air. Jake. His heart skipped a beat. He froze, turning in place to scan the trees. But there was nothing. No one. "Jake, come closer." His pulse quickened. The voice was softer now, more urgent. It sounded like his name. His full name. No one knew his name out here. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the emptiness. His breath quickened, forming little clouds in the cool air. He strained his ears, but the forest was eerily still. And then it came again, a faint rustling from behind him. Jake turned, but there was nothing, just the black trunks of trees and the mist swirling between them. The whisper was closer now, a voice so soft it was almost lost in the wind. "Come closer." He felt a chill creep down his spine. Something wasn't right. He wanted to leave, but his legs felt heavy, as though the earth itself was holding him in place. The whispers continued, growing louder, now coming from all directions. "You know what happened to them, don't you?" Jake's heart slammed in his chest. He spun around, his breath ragged, but he saw no one. "They never left." The voice was colder now, more menacing. "You won't either." The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and the trees closed in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Panic surged through him, and he took a step back, only to hear the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. The whispers escalated into frantic mutterings, unintelligible words spinning around him like a storm. "Stop it!" Jake shouted, clutching his head, feeling as though his mind were being torn apart by the voices. "Come closer." Jake broke into a run, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. But no matter how fast he ran, the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the path before him narrowing and shifting. The trees twisted and warped, blocking his way. His eyes darted between them, but no matter which direction he looked, the path remained the same, narrow, dark, and winding. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. The whispers followed him, crawling into his ears, scraping against his sanity. "They never left. You won't either." In a burst of desperation, Jake stumbled, falling to the ground. He pressed his hands to the cold earth, his fingers digging into the soil as though it could anchor him to reality. The whispers were all around him now, suffocating, drowning out his thoughts. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure, shrouded in the mist, standing motionless. Its face was pale, gaunt, like something dead. Eyes hollow and staring, its lips moved in a silent chant. Jake tried to scream, but the air around him thickened, pressing in on his chest. He couldn't breathe. His vision blurred, and the whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the figure moving toward him, its twisted form drawing closer, the shadows of the trees swallowing him whole. The next morning, the people of Ravenswood found Jake. His body was lying at the edge of the forest, lifeless and cold. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, and his mouth was twisted into a silent scream. But the most chilling part? His body was clutching a single leaf, the edges of which were blackened and scorched. As the townsfolk gathered around, Old Tom watched from his porch, his face grim. He had seen this happen before. He had warned him. The Whispering Woods claimed another soul, and the whispers would never stop. In 1998, I got a new teaching job in a new town. To save money, I moved into a small house that was for rent. My roommate, Claire, was nice enough and the two of us got along easily. I moved in and found my room. While unpacking, I came across an old framed photograph. 3 men dressed as hospital orderlies were sitting together in the living room of the house. These 3 men had once lived in the house I was now renting with Claire. I didn't want to throw away the photograph, it didn't seem right. But I didn't want to keep it, either. I chose to hang the picture up in the living room as decoration and a reminder of the friendship that once bloomed in the house. On the first night, I was awakened by Claire stumbling around in the dark in my bedroom. Flipping on the lights, I saw Claire and realized that she was sleepwalking. I called her name and finally woke Claire up, and she, confused by what had happened, apologized and told me that she had never slept-walked before. Claire was shaking. She then went on to explain that she was having a vivid and bizarre dream. In her dream, she was in a hospital and a woman, a patient, was holding her hand and leading her down the hallway as if the woman wanted Claire to see something. The next morning, I went for a jog and spied an abandoned building a few blocks away from my house. The building was massive, the windows broken and the doors chained. There were no signs on the outside of the building, but by all outward appearances it looked like a hospital. I was staring at the building as if in a trance when I noticed that there was something, or someone looking back at me from the fifth-floor window. As soon as I made eye contact, it disappeared. The whole area, the building and the quiet creeped me out. I ran for home. That night Claire and I sat down together to watch a movie, drink some wine and talk. When I brought up my crazy ex-boyfriend, Claire laughed a little. She remarked that my ex sounded like her during her wilder days. She went on to tell me that she had a mental breakdown a few years ago and that she was on medication, but she was better now and it was all behind her. Her story sent a chill up my spine. I barely knew her and I learn about this. Later when I went to bed, I heard a crash outside my window. I threw back the curtain and saw Claire walking off the porch, breaking a flower pot as she moved. I opened my window and yelled her name, but she didn't respond. Claire was walking down the street toward the abandoned hospital, sleepwalking, her hand outstretched as if she was being guided by some unseen force. I threw on some clothes and ran outside the house, still calling Claire's name. By the time I caught up to her, she was stepping inside the hospital doors. Someone had unchained the doors. I was too afraid to walk inside the hospital after her. I hesitated and I regret it to this day. When I finally worked up the nerve to walk inside, I was greeted by an elderly homeless woman. I asked her if she had seen anyone come into the hospital just now, and all she did was smile at me and turn away. I panicked and stepped back outside. The foreboding feeling was overwhelming. I looked up at the hospital and saw Claire hanging out a window on the 5th floor. I yelled her name, but I couldn't get her attention. I'll never forget the look on her face. Pure terror. Claire kept leaning out the window and looking back into the hospital as if she was afraid of someone or something. Sometimes she'd look down, seemingly straight at me, but she still never saw me. I called her name desperately as I watched her climb out through the window and jump. She died in front of me. The police arrived and I told them everything about Claire's sleepwalking. But when they learned about her history of mental illness, they quickly chalked it up to a suicide, and that was the end of her story. A week later I read her obituary in the newspaper, and in the article they confirmed that the abandoned hospital was in fact a hospital. A mental hospital. I fell asleep that night. I had a very strange dream. I was walking down the hall of a hospital, a woman in a hospital gown holding my hand. She was guiding me somewhere, and she kept looking back to make sure I was still following. The snapping of fingers and a man's voice startled me awake. I had been dreaming. I had been sleepwalking. I had walked the 4 blocks from my house to the street of the abandoned hospital. A man had almost hit me with his car. If he hadn't have woken me up, I'm not sure what wouldn't happened. The idea of sleep was now terrifying. So much had happened in such little time. I tried to keep awake for as long as possible. But eventually, as it often does, sleep overtook me. The dream, the same dream about being in the hospital, repeated. This time when I woke up, however, I wasn't in my bed or standing in the street. I was laying the bed frame of an old cot inside the hospital. Scared, I walked through the halls trying to find the stairs and get out, but I found nothing. I heard muffled voices and screams coming from all the empty rooms that lined the halls. I rounded a corner and came face to face with 3 people all dressed as patients. One patient was the woman from my dream. I backed away and told myself they weren't real. If I ignored them, they'd go away. I kept searching for the exit and heard another screaming voice from behind a door. There was an orange glow creeping out from under the door and through the small window on the door. I peeked inside and a man's face peeked back. His face was burned, horribly burned. He begged me to let him out, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the door. I turned and saw the same 3 patients as I had before. One by one the 3 patients approached the window and jumped out. I looked out the window, but I didn't see them. I saw 3 orderlies running from the building in a panic. I yelled for them, but they didn't stop. That's when I smelled the smoke. I turned and saw the orange flames stretching out from under the door and smoke filling every hallway. I had no choice. I had to jump. I approached the window and prepared to leap out when I felt a hand on my arm. I looked over and saw the homeless woman pulling me away from the window. She led me out of the hospital and I ran for my life. The rest of the night I stayed awake and did some research on the hospital. It was abandoned 20 years ago after a fire ravaged the hospital. The orderlies all fled from the building and left their patients behind, to burn alive. I moved out of the house the next morning and back in with my parents. I haven't sleepwalked since. I'm Nina Rodriguez. I'm a police officer, have been for a good 7 years. In my time in the force, I have seen some pretty fucked up shit, to say the least. Crazed druggies, abusive parents, and even a few calls for help from the suicides. But none of those could ever hope to compare to an emergency call I'd taken last month. I now abhor taking emergency calls, not because of the over-worried people calling about every little squeak in their house, the noise complaints, or even the occasional prank call, though those could get pretty annoying. No, the worst thing about taking an emergency call is knowing that I had to sit on the other side of a phone and, no matter how much I hoped or how fast a squad car could get there, had absolutely no power over the situation. The following is, unfortunately, this situation. The day was like any other, monotonous in its predictability. It was a Wednesday night and the end of my shift was still a ways off. Don't get me wrong, I love being a police officer, but I didn't sign up to be a secretary. I sighed and flipped through the files on my desk, absent-mindedly scanning through the different reports from earlier that day. There was nothing of dire importance. No hit-and-runs, robberies, or violence. Life in the country didn't require as much police attention as, say, any of the major cities. My phone rang on the corner of my desk, waking me from my thoughts. 991. What's your emergency? I said in a monochrome tone. Please, I need your help. A small feminine voice answered. I leaned forward. Yes, what's the emergency, ma'am? I repeated, preparing my pen and pad. There's someone outside my house, he's just standing there. She answered, sounding frightened. This was not entirely unusual situation. There have been several different cases filed for crazed stalkers. Now, stay calm, everything's going to be all right, I said in my most convincing and gentle voice. I then continued with the standard questions. And how long has he been there, ma'am? I don't know. I just looked out the window a while ago and he was just standing there. He just appeared there a little while after it got dark. That was about an hour ago. And he hasn't moved an inch or ever stopped looking at me. I stopped writing. This was getting a little strange. A person just standing in one place, never moving or even looking away. Whoever this was, I had a feeling that they could be very dangerous. Okay, ma'am, we'll send an officer. What's your name and street address? Elizabeth Traville, 1465 Wellington Row. With a hum, I wrote down the address and gave it to an officer on standby and he went on his way there. Okay, ma'am, we are sending a cruiser now. I could hear an audible sigh of relief. In the meantime, I began, can you try to describe the man to me? Do you know him? I asked, identifying the perp and making sure she was safe were the most important things at this time. Well, I definitely don't know him, or anyone with that body type. He's tall, very tall, pale and skinny, almost emaciated looking. And he's naked, I think. But I think he's too far to tell. Okay, can you see his face? Describe it for me? No, it's too dark to see his face. And I don't know how to describe it, but I know he's definitely looking at me. Has been the whole time he's been here. Are all your doors locked? I asked. I think my back door's still unlocked. I'll go lock it real quick. Okay, I'll stay online. I heard her walk around and the familiar resonant click of a deadbolt lock could be heard. Okay, I am back. Now everything's locked and she trailed off. What is it, ma'am? I asked. Ma'am. I grew more and more uncomfortable in the silence. The quiet seemed to last forever until she spoke again in a more hushed tone than before. "He's closer now. Before he was just at the edge of my woods, tens of yards away, but now he's only half that. It's important that you stay calm. Now, can you see any of his features now that he's closer?" "Yeah, it's weird. He is naked, but I cannot see any genitals or hair or any defining features. It's like he's wearing some skin-tight suit. I still cannot really see his face, but I can tell it's deformed in some way. He's still staring at me. It's so unnerving. Okay, ma'am, I am going to need you to find a safe place to lock yourself in case anything goes wrong," I said as calmly as possible, trying not to scare her any farther. "Why, yeah, okay. My bedroom door has a lock and so does my bathroom." She trailed off once more and I could hear a small whimper. "Ma'am? Is everything all right? He's closer." Her voice was so quiet that if I was not listening so intently, I could have missed it. "Ma'am?" I asked again. "He's so much closer." I just absent-mindedly looked at my bathroom for a second, and then he cleared the almost 30 yards from where he was to the house. But at least now I can make out his, "Oh God." "Ma'am?" My voice came out in a small peep. I was on the edge of my chair. "Oh God, his face. I can see his face. It's pressed up against the window. It's awful. His eyes are so large, like black pool balls bulging out of his head, and he has this smile that goes from ear to ear, or where his ears should be." She let out with a sob. I needed to stop her from getting hysterical over whatever it was on the other side of her window. "Ma'am, you are going to need to go to that safe place now," I said, regaining my commanding voice. No reply. "Ma'am." I was interrupted. "Help me." Her voice begged through the speaker of the phone and was soon followed by the sound of breaking glass. The phone clattered onto the floor with the clack of hollow plastic. She let out a loud shriek. She said various pleas, begging to be let go, but to no avail. Her screams trailed away, sounding more and more far off until I could not hear her any more. Nothing but silence followed, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. I did not know how long I sat there waiting for something, anything. I also did not realize how tightly I was holding into the phone, not until I heard the sirens of a police car and hung up. That was the squad car that I had sent out not 15 minutes ago. In the heart of Hyderabad, nestled between the narrow lanes of the old city, there stood a decrepit mansion known as the Tsuli Kut Shahi House. Abandoned for decades, the mansion bore witness to a dark and mysterious past that whispered through its crumbling walls. Rumors of a curse surrounded the mansion, and locals spoke of eerie lights flickering in its broken windows at night. Despite the warnings, a group of adventurous friends decided to explore the haunted Tsuli Kut Shahi House on a moonless night. As they stepped into the mansion's creaking entrance, the air grew thick with an oppressive silence. The friends, armed with flashlights and nerves of steel, navigated through the dusty corridors and dilapidated rooms. The once opulent interiors now echoed with the haunting footsteps of the past. In one room, they discovered an old portrait covered in a tattered cloth. With trepidation, they unveiled the painting, revealing the stern face of a man with piercing eyes. A sudden chill swept through the room as they noticed a striking resemblance between the man in the portrait and one of their friends. Unease settled among the group as they continued their exploration. Strange whispers seemed to drift from the shadows, and ghostly apparitions danced at the edge of their vision. The air became stifling, and each step felt like a descent into an abyss of malevolence. As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon a hidden chamber beneath the mansion. In the center of the room lay an ancient, dusty book. Intrigued, they opened it, revealing cryptic symbols and ominous writings that spoke of a curse that bound the mansion to a tormented soul. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and the flickering lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. The friends realized they were not alone. The ghostly figure of the man from the portrait materialized before them. his eyes burning with a vengeful fire. The curse, it seemed, had awakened, seeking retribution for sins long buried. Panic set in as the friends scrambled to escape the malevolent presence. But the mansion seemed to come alive, its walls closing in on them, trapping them in a nightmarish maze. Desperation consumed them as they fought against an unseen force, their screams echoing through the haunted halls. In the end, the Tsuli Kut Shahi house claimed its victims, its cursed legacy continuing to linger in the shadows of Hyderabad, warning others to heed the ominous tales of the past.